and a very warm welcome coming to you from a different location. We're joining you once again at Hyde Park on Other Terana 24. And tonight on our discussion, we will be talking about, again, South Asia. But we have a visiting expert, an economist who is in Sri Lanka, who's very fond of Sri Lanka. Of course, someone from the region who is talking about economics in the region and how the region can be connected and integrated for sustainability and prosperity of our collective. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Swarnim WAGLÉ, Member of Parliament of Nepal. He is also the chair of the Institute of Integrated Development Studies, a South Asian policy think tank established in Kathmandu in 1979, and a former chief economist and economic advisor of the UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific in New York, covering 36 years. And that's a long
36
time.
countries.
36 countries, rather. Okay, sorry about that. But 36 countries, that's a scope across many regions again. Let's start off about you visiting Sri Lanka. You were here last year at the height of the crisis. You met now President during your current visit, but then when he was Member of Parliament in May 2022. Let's begin there.
Yes. So thank you. It's a pleasure to join you in INDEEWARI. And as you indicated, I have a very fond association with Sri Lanka. I lived here actually for 2 years during 2005, 2006, and have come to Sri Lanka quite frequently for various conferences. But a major consequential visit was last year when at the thick of the crisis, I was here as the Chief Economic Advisor for UNDP Asia Pacific and had a chance to address the Parliament of Sri Lanka through one of the public finance committees, interacted with the governor at that time, but most importantly met Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, who is now leading Sri Lanka out of this economic crisis as president. So last year, it is very much, we're trying to make sense of what led to this crisis and what could be the path out of this crisis, right? So the major discussion at the time was how to restock your foreign exchange reserves, right? Because that was really at the heart of the crisis. It had been rapidly depleted, for a 80 billion plus economy, to have less than $50 million in the bank. You were unable to import the basic essentials, food, medicine, and all the other fuel. So that was really the immediate thing, and that had led to riots, a lot of political instability. So that had to be stabilized. So the primary focus was there. Then, but as I wrote a paper with Premachandra Athukorala at the time, looking at, this is an immediate balance of payments crisis. But if you take a 10-year horizon, then it becomes a solvency crisis because the debt overhang and, how do you become solvent as a country? That was an issue. But if you go back 50 years, then you look at all the other economic incentives that have gone awry, right? I mean, Sri Lanka was one of the earliest reformers and liberalizers in the whole region in 77. But obviously, some of that early momentum and traction was lost. So is there an anti-trade bias in the overall economic structure that is holding Sri Lanka's growth potentials behind and all that? So it's there's an immediate assessment, there's a medium-term assessment, and there's even a long-term assessment. So it is more as a policy / academic kind of an exercise. But of course, the visit last year was very much focused on the immediate assistance and how the big lenders, neighboring countries, as well as international organizations like the IMF could come in, and if they were to come in, what would be the consequences, and we assessed pros and cons, it was a very, very fruitful exercise, and I was very honored to meet him again at this time.
That sounds like you've been engaging with our authorities since the crisis and now. But let's go back to your address to the Committee of Public Finance in Parliament you mentioned. What was your engagement like? Was there some sort of assessment done with them on the current crisis back then?
I sense that there was a lot of anxiety then, right? So, these are elected politicians, leaders, Sri Lanka was for a long time celebrated as a success story in South Asia, and suddenly to be in this deep morass, that was, I could sense that there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, and what next? Who can help us? How can we get out of this together? So there were very seasoned economists there in the room as well, and some politicians who were projected as future finance ministers, etc. So it was, and the speaker was there, and all very prominent MPs were there. So I was trying to take them through this trajectory. And what I find this, as a Nepali politician now myself, I find that when an objective foreigner or a foreign expert comes and tells them, there's less baggage there, right? There's more objectivity. And if a fellow Sri Lankan was narrating to them the same story, they would be finger pointing, you were in the government at the time, and this and that, right? Whereas an objectively, without taking any sides, so agnostic of the domestic political hiccups, if somebody with a background like mine, who has a very fond association with Sri Lanka, loves the country, is an avid South Asian, very much as a Nepali is looking up to Sri Lanka on so many of the positive dimensions. I thought, and at the time as a UN chief economic advisor, that veneer of sort of neutrality and credibility also. So I had a very warm welcome. And the parliament, really publicized the event at the time through the social media handles and all that. But overall, in substance, it was a very rich engagement with the MPs. First, I made a presentation for about an hour, and then there was an open Q&A, which I remember lasted for more than an hour.
But do you think, apart from how the anxiety towards this situation, did those MPs have an understanding of the situation by then, where Sri Lanka had gone wrong? And with your current engagements, do you see that Sri Lanka has understood the depth of the crisis and have tried or attempted to address this from a point of view of an economist?
Definitely your top leadership, right? The governor of the central bank, Bank of Ceylon, and the Right Honorable President himself, they get it, right? They understand it. They're seasoned veterans, experts who've been through a lot in the last few decades. At the level of common MPs, let's say, or other representatives, it becomes a political economic story. So at the top level, what ought to be done, what led to the crisis, what are the economic solutions to this. That's very clear. But the implementation of that becomes a political economic story. So every decision will have winners and losers, right? So people who are used to benefiting from the status quo will tend to resist, right? So this is where the more painful, public finance related reforms, civil service reforms, central bank independence, anti-corruption and good governance measures will start to collide with the self-interests or the vested interests of certain groups. And this is why economic reforms are always a painful exercise, not just in Sri Lanka, everywhere in the world. And it takes that historic opportunity, so leaders who can seize that historical opportunity to really chart a different course. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis in the United States, Rahm Emanuel, the first chief of staff to Barack Obama, said, never waste a good crisis. Use it as an opportunity to really reorient. In good times, there's no pressure to make a departure, right? It's at times of crisis that you need to undertake some very unpopular measures, and this is when leadership is tested, and this is when the enlightened citizenry really have to rally behind good economics and good political reforms.
Do you think Sri Lanka is actually using this crisis to bounce back or to have a longer term sustainable growth in terms of the policies and the reforms that we are undertaking? We know that the IMF came back with their first review, and the second tranche was delayed. But in terms of reforms, whether it's tax or other transparency, governance-related reforms, are we on track?
So, not to the extent that was initially conceived. So the IMF has come up with a $3 billion extended fund facility, EFF, And that comes with a series of conditions, especially on the consolidation of your public finance, right? So the revenue or the tax to GDP ratio is fairly low in Sri Lanka. So there are lots of tax exemptions, and collection is not strong enough. The enforcement of many legislative measures is not strong. So on average, you are at less than 10% of GDP. Even my country, which is much poorer than Sri Lanka, is at 20% of GDP, our tax collection, although it's fragile, it's all taxing imports and all that. Nonetheless, I think Sri Lanka could do a lot more in consolidating its fiscal house. The way debt structuring is proceeding, I think there's some improvements to be had. But in its entirety, if you step back and take a bigger picture, it becomes a governance story. And this is where the IMF's governance diagnostic study is exceptionally important, right? They're very candid. They talk about corruption, vulnerabilities, and all the other blind spots in the governance of this country, and that ought to be tackled head on.
You are from the region. You are one of us. The IMF EFF programs. This is our 17th, and that comes with conditions. And this IMF program is not very popular in Sri Lanka because it's at times a political slogan, at times a reason for unexplainable conditions imposed on Sri Lanka. And from the citizen to politician, it is believed that the West is imposing conditions that a country like Sri Lanka or South Asia should be,
No, I think the leadership has to do a better job in explaining the circumstances. You didn't need to go to the IMF, right? But you had to go to the IMF because there was nobody else coming and rescuing you. And when you go to the IMF, most countries, not just Sri Lanka, you're already in a deep economic trouble. So the IMF gets blamed for a lot of the mess that the politicians created, and they are asked, at the very end, when the plot has thickened and things are in a real mess. This is not just Sri Lanka. Argentina comes to mind, Eastern European countries come to mind. But IMF too, in the past, I would say 15-20 years ago, at the time of the Asian financial crisis, 97 for example, they did get many things wrong as well, right? And when it came to addressing the social side of the economic crisis, vulnerabilities, taking off subsidies, getting rid of social protection measures that are, shielding vulnerable people from the shocks of the crisis, IMF used to be quite insensitive. But I think they've learned their way, and there's, these days, while the technical economic merits are being pursued on the one hand, they are also mindful of what that means on the social side. But I do, on balance though, they're all professionals, and Sri Lanka owns part of the IMF. We're all, it's not some foreign entity that is coming in. It's not a multinational corporation. It's a multilateral international organizations. All of us have shares, and there are Sri Lankan professionals working there, very well-known folks, both at the World Bank and the IMF. So I think this has to be explained to the people. That and if sometimes this ultra-nationalism often gets in the way, and it's at the detriment of the country. Maybe these guys have their interests safeguarded, and IMF becomes a convenient punching bag, right? But right now, for example, without the 3 billion coming from the IMF, and they wouldn't just give it to you to again continue the perverse subsidies, just pay back loans indiscriminately, and all that, because that's also somebody else's money. In fact, it's the world's sort of money, right? So, and they have to put conditions, and their conditions are necessary often for the country. Now, one could quibble with the sequencing of it, what comes before, what comes next, does it need to be this harsh early on? Those can be debated, and this is what the function of the, the professionals in the Ministry of Finance, the Treasury or the Central Bank, this is what they do, right? But once you agree on a pact, there's a credible sort of timeline that other investors are also watching, right? And if you start reneging, if you say we'll do it and then it's something to not take on early, in the first place, right? But once you sign and seal the deal, it's very important to follow through, right? Otherwise, that sends a signal that this is not a serious country, that it reneges on its promises, it's not credible enough. And that's always a problem for developing countries, especially middle-income countries like Sri Lanka, which eventually have to rely on private sources of financing. The concessional window has dried up. right? The IDA and others that the World Bank, for example, issues, or the Asian Development Bank at highly concessional rates is no longer available to the middle income country.
I'd like to talk more about South Asia now, but before that I'd like to go back to a comment you made about Sri Lanka's crisis. You mentioned that Sri Lanka adopted reforms early on but did not see the results that we would have or we should have anticipated. Again, was it the handouts or the wrong and mismanagement of public finances or wrong policies that led Sri Lanka into this, in your understanding?
If you go back to 77, the early reforms, the trade liberalization, even India hadn't liberalized by then. India was forced to liberalize in 91, right? And now looking back, of course, some of those liberal measures also have to be nuanced and understood slightly differently. But the problem with Sri Lanka, you mentioned that this is the 17th time that Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF. You see, if you look at the previous packages, it turns out programs would proceed and then they would be halted, they would be stalled and not carried through, when it came to a point when the unpopular measures had to be implemented. So if you do an assessment, objective assessment of many of the previous packages, things have not been complete at all, right? And so that's a problem. So when it comes to taking unpopular measures, I wish the leadership in this country had stepped up, explained to the people, taken the people along. If you look at East Asian success stories, there's a generation or two that have to go through that struggle, right, before a country really takes off. And here it looks like some of the profligate public finance, generous handouts, perverse subsidies, things like that have persisted because nobody has had the guts to pull the plug or reorient it into more constructive directions.
Because
right?
that's not very popular.
It's not popular. And this is where statesmen are born, right? If you go with the flow, if you just follow the mass and not lead the mass, then you are not a leader, right? So it's ultimately bad economics is a result of bad politics, almost invariably everywhere.
India, back in 1991, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't have to go back to the IMF again. So if we look at our own countries here in the region, sometimes we're ridiculed saying a bunch of poor nations, but this is where really there's potential. Our region has a number of advantages, the best brains in the world. We see brain drain happening to the rest of the world, but this is where it all begins. So how do you really connect all this to see an coordinated and integrated growth plan for the region?
For the South Asia region? Well, India obviously is the major dynamo, as the dominant share of population as well as the size of the economy. So what happens in India will impact the neighborhood, but not to the extent that we would want, because we're not as connected as we ought to be. The European Union, if you look at the intra-EU trade, if you look at Mercosur in Latin America, the intra-Latin American trade is much higher. ASEAN, just next door, immense sort of intra-regional trade. In South Asia, this infamous number of less than 5% is still there. But India, that is partly shaped by the asymmetric size of India, right? So even if we double trade volumes right now, we'd still arrive at around 8% or something from 5%. Which means, because India is so big, right? So a lot of trade within India doesn't count as an intra-regional trade. That technicality aside, we need to do a much better job, both on the physical side of things and on the physical and the harder integration and the softer integration. So by hard integration, what about the air connectivities? What about the rail connectivities? What about the water connectivities? And what about the road connectivities? And then the energy connectivity is also becoming much more prominent, and that's actually an area of excitement in an era of climate change, as the whole world is seeking to decarbonize during this century. What are the opportunities for clean energy trading amongst the region? And I can speak a little bit about that, how Nepal, Bhutan, India and Bangladesh, and possibly Sri Lanka, even through undersea cables, might actually join the game eventually. The softer side is more on the what kind of trade agreements do you have? What kind of regulations do you have? What is your attitude towards non-tariff barriers? What is your attitude towards non-tariff measures, right? So all these nuances that facilitate engagement, and worse than intra-regional trade, is intra-regional investment. We don't invest in each other's country. This hotel happens to be another South Asian investment. Taj itself is a famous Indian brand, but we have very little of these. And the more intense we are in terms of trade engagements, investment flows, people-to-people, connectivity. I'm so glad to see there's a direct Lanka flight to Kathmandu now. When I was working here in 2006, I almost took 20 hours to get here from Kathmandu, go to Bangkok, transit, and then a midnight flight to Colombo. It was such an embarrassment.
Making it next to impossible for us to connect with each other.
Now at least there's a direct
Yes.
flight, 3 hours. We need much more of this. And so physical and hard infrastructure connectivity, and the softer infrastructure in terms of regulations, policies, and overall a change in mindset that there's so much to be tapped from each other's complementarities, that there's a win-win outcome if we integrated more, if we collaborated more.
We don't really look close to our neighbors, closest neighbors. We always talk about diversifying into markets, whether it's Europe, East Asia, or the United States and the larger American area. But what barriers are we talking about here? We've been listening to many saying, these tariffs and barriers are really an impediment to trade. This has been one of your expertise over the years.
So I worked a lot on trade issues. So it was fine, let's say, until up to the 2000s. To look to the richer markets for trade, right? If you have products to sell, you sell it to people who can afford it, right? So South Asia was for a long time very poor. So it made sense for Sri Lankans or Nepalis or even Indians and Bangladeshis and Pakistanis to look for rich country markets. So that meant the United States or North America and Europe, right, mostly, and Japan. But things are changing now. The global center of economic gravity is shifting from the middle of the Atlantic, as Danny Qua has quantified, has moved to about Poland and Helsinki kind of region around 2010. And by 2050, it would have landed, that hypothetical point of center of economic gravity would be along the Himalayas in Nepal, to reflect the South Asian economic dynamo. You have the Chinese behemoth, and you have the Southeast Asian economy. So that's a huge, so that shift means now we have richer markets in our proximity. So you fly for 4 hours from Colombo, you're probably catering to, a little more than 4 hours, but from Kathmandu, 4 hours would cater to half the world, which is on average getting richer, right? So that, what is it? More tourists, more investment, more concessional finance, more people-to-people ties, other forms of engagement, academic engagement, cultural engagements, etc. And that's a good thing for the economy. And but we haven't. This reality is still being held back by our mindset from 50, 60 years ago, where we need to worry about security. How can we let things open? How can we open our borders? And so sometimes there's a conflict between the security imperatives and the economic potentials right there to be reaped, right? And this is the balance that seasoned statesmen need to make, and as a collective entity. So SAARC was, drawn up in that spirit. So in a sense, it came after ASEAN, but ASEAN initially was a security setup, then evolved, transformed itself into an economic bloc. SAARC was a late start. Started well, even though it started late, had some early progress, but now has fizzled out, largely because of Indo-Pakistan hostilities. And this is what has led to many sub-regional initiatives now. But on the bilateral front, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, there's a nice relationship. India, Sri Lanka is a good relationship. Bangladesh, India has improved a lot. Nepal, India, often a fraught relationship. We see India as a big brother. That also is now in a very constructive mood, despite some hiccups on the border, etc. And Bhutan, India was always positive. Now the question I pose is, all these vibrant, positive bilateral relationships, can they be quadrilateralized? Can they be sub-regional? And they act as a stepping stone to a much larger regional and even a global vision.
You've been talking about the positive bilateral relations, but we're talking here about how we can gel it into regional integration. In that case, is there a possibility now that Sri Lanka is looking at enhanced FTAs with countries. We're negotiating a Thailand FTA and also the comprehensive agreements to the Indo-Lanka agreement, and even with China. With all that, Sri Lanka is also aspiring to be a hub status for the region, and I believe South Asia is also on the cards. What potential is there to really bring the region together to be a trading, maritime, or even an economic hub for the region?
Sri Lanka engaging bilaterally outside of South Asia is also a positive thing for Sri Lanka. It opens big markets for your products. So if you have a preferential market access to Southeast Asian economies, Thailand is a pretty big economy, China is huge. That's a good opportunity for your products, not just for your tea and coconuts and rubber and garments, but even for IT products, right? A lot of the digitalization is there, and to bring in tourists from those sort of growing middle income countries. But there's another aspect to this, that other investors seeking to enter the Chinese market could make Sri Lanka as the base. Right? If you came here, located your industries here, let's say a Polish firm, or an Argentinian firm or a factory would be located here, they would need to add a degree of value, maybe 15, 20, 25% here. So that could be Sri Lankan labor force getting employment. Then it becomes a made in Sri Lanka product, even irrespective of the investor, and gaining preferential market access to these large markets. Many countries have done that. The fact that there is an Israel-US free trade agreement or a Jordan-United States free trade agreement meant that many industries have located in Jordan to have access through Jordan to the massive United States market. Now these countries would never have had a direct BTA or a FTA with the United States. It's very cumbersome. It's you need to be on the sort of geopolitical priority, etc. And not all countries are on that list. But similarly with Africa, United States gave something not on a bilateral reciprocal basis, but on a unilateral preference for Africa, African Growth and Opportunity Act. You know what happened? Then all the Chinese and the Pakistani investors were actually locating in Africa to get access to the United States. So free trade is a very nuanced, complex game. It's not just a bilateral, signing of agreement. It can get the economy in motion. There's a flip side that policymakers need to watch out for. When you enter into a BTA, the other party will also want things that you may not be ready to give yet, right? And this is partly a problem with when you have asymmetric trade relationships. When you do a trade agreement with a very rich country, they want your, let's say, services sectors opened up, and the entire telecom opened up, logistics opened up, airlines opened up, even media opened up, and you may not be ready when you are at lower levels of income. But oftentimes you feel as a country that this is a price worth paying. I give some access to sectors of interest to them to have a more preferential, a better market access for products of interest to us. That's when you sort of work out a win-win trade agreement. But it is, I am happy that Sri Lanka is looking at countries which are comparable in per capita income, like Vietnam, let's say, but also much slightly higher, not radically higher, so that the degree of asymmetry is lessened.
We're seeking inroads into new markets, but at the same time enhancing trade opportunities with existing markets. But in terms of investments, we're talking about barriers to trade, ease of doing business in Sri Lanka. Is this common across the region, or is Sri Lanka behind in enabling a smooth entry for investors?
Sri Lanka and the rest of South Asia are all behind on this because we carry that baggage of a state control, regulation. Private sector guys are often crooks. We need to control them, regulate them, and stop them and monitor them and all that. That's not the right attitude, right? I mean, the bad folks, let there be fair rules of the game, which will catch up to them, and they will face the law, right? But you can't use a minority of an experiment, a sample, to then blacklist the entire community. And this is where I think our attitudes have been quite backward in South Asia generally. If you look at the doing business indicators of the World Bank, which was suspended for a year or two and is coming back again in a different guise, it tracks the life cycle of a firm, right? From the time you decide to get started as a private enterprise, and then how the licensing and the construction permits, how you trade, paying taxes, whether you protect minority investors or not, whether you trade, and after you shut down, let's say you are bankrupt, how easy it is to get out of that bankruptcy, How do you deal with the insolvency? So it's a complete life cycle. And on those measures, doing indicators measures, it's nicely benchmarked against other countries, and it's very clear that Sri Lanka is behind. Nepal used to be behind. India made a fast progress on that. And I think those kind of global benchmarking exercise tell you on which indicators are behind. And what struck me at the time, the last indicators that I checked, a country like Rwanda was way ahead of Sri Lanka, even though on per capita terms, Rwanda is still, very much poorer.
What are they doing different?
It's just reforms. And so on all the sort of 10 pillars, for example, from getting started to tackling insolvency, on this life cycle, all the indicators that matter to doing business, they were enacting new regulations, scrapping procedures, making it easy, digitalizing things. So, once you take away that discretionary authority of the middleman, of the bureaucrats, things move fast, right? And Singapore and New Zealand and Finland, we're not often talking about the US and UK only, smaller reform-oriented. Israel, the startup nation, as it's been called. So I think there's a lot to learn from these smaller, fast-moving, reform-oriented countries, and just mimic that, copy that, because a lot of the reforms are still low-hanging. It's stroke of the pen reforms. What becomes harder to do is the institutional reforms, and this is where Sri Lanka is stuck at, right? It may be, abolishing many of the state entities. It may be downsizing and retrenchment of, things that are bloated, and your tax base is not big enough to sustain it, and you're even having to borrow to even sustain current expenditures, let alone undertake capital expenditures. So I think, and this is where ultimately good economics originates from good politics and visionary leadership, and countries that have made it have done it through that, right? Lee Kuan Yew's famous examples, I actually, there's a lot of urban legend and myth on what Lee Kuan Yew is supposed to have said when he visited Sri Lanka in the 50s and the 60s, but the actual quotes were very inspiring, the clean sort of, obviously is referring to the colonial architecture, etc. Sterling reserves, he talks about some of the visionary leaders that you had around the time of independence, and a slow sort of slide into ethno-nationalism, etc. He's already warned that in the 60s, and these issues, and of course he then goes on to lead Singapore and, becomes this, but Sri Lanka and Singapore were on the same page at one time. And of course, you had a long, brush with a terrible conflict and all that. But what led to that and how you came out of it, etc., also has implications for the economic fortunes of this country. But nonetheless, INDEEWARI, I want to remind that Sri Lanka is still a bright spot in South Asia, right? An early reformer, all the investments in women's empowerment that happened here, health and education. When I was a student of economics at the London School of Economics and at Harvard, Sri Lanka used to come as an example, prominent example. Amartya Sen always cited Sri Lanka. But you did, I think, lose that early momentum, partly because of bad governance and political choices that have been made.
That's truly unfortunate for the country, for the region.
But you have all the fundamentals to really take off again. The location, the products, the people and the diaspora, it's all there. What would it take to trigger and then sustain that high rates of growth? Leadership that can carry through a whole slew of reforms, some of which might be unpopular, but you have to swallow it if you really want to be the Singapore of South Asia again.
Certainly, and I was saying, as you mentioned before, make use of this crisis as an opportunity, as a springboard for development. Before we wrap up, I'd like to touch upon, a little about Nepal-Sri Lanka relations. We've missed out on talking about that. You lived in Sri Lanka for 2 years, back in 2006? Five and six.
Yeah. Okay. Just after the Boxing Day tsunami, I came here, and I lived here for 2 years, yeah.
And that was in your capacity with the UN?
I was an economist with the UNDP regional program. So I was located in Colombo, but I covered the entire region. So I used to travel quite a bit from Colombo, and I remember taking an apartment on Duplication Road and jogging along the ocean, and it was a beautiful time.
So what took you to become a member of parliament in Nepal, from an economist to parliament?
So that's an interesting question. So I always had this fascination with public policy and public affairs. And I was a good student in high school, and the parental and the societal choice was for good students to either become a doctor or an engineer. Maybe the preference is the same here in Sri Lanka too, but I chose to do economics from the earliest days. So I departed from that conventional path, and the point of being an economist was to really take a look at the entire economy and the society and how to lift countries' well-being, collective well-being and individual living standards, etc. So that excited me, right? Why are some countries richer than others? That's philosophically a very profound question to tackle, and I was always intrigued by that. And the opportunities that I got, to study at LSE, Harvard, later ANU, and then work in international organizations, so gave me that rich foundation and experiences, skills, the way to look at the world, understand it, assess it differently. And I said, hang on, but I come from a very modest, humble background in Nepal. I was born in a village in Gorkha in the west of Nepal. I've had this privilege of seeing the world, understanding the world, studying at the best institutions, working at the best institutions. Let me take some of this back to my own country and try it out. It's not easy. I recently took a plunge into electoral politics. I contested a very charged sort of election in a district called Tanahu, but I won, and I'm now serving my first term in parliament. But the politics is a noble profession. It can be a noble profession. It has been corrupted. It has been perverted, and we need to fight that, because ultimately, as I have been highlighting, good economics originates from good politics. And if we can clean this up, if you have good people in politics, a lot of the other education, social protection, health, environment, climate change, physical infrastructure, follows from good leadership and good politics.
Certainly. I'm told we don't have much time, but one last question. I'll bring a few points together from what you've mentioned. Energy integration. Sri Lanka is also looking at an energy grid with India, the rest of the region, and we know that Nepal also has ventured into this area. That and how Sri Lanka and Nepal can really work together. We're looking at bilateral relations, yes, but something that would help the region come together.
Create an investment in products that are of interest to us, right? So things Sri Lanka can export to Nepal, then that we already import from other countries, there's something to look there. And products that Nepal can send to Sri Lanka, let's explore that. Because of the distance and the connectivity is still not firm, the air connectivity is very nascent and quite expensive. I think the people-to-people ties, and we have Lumbini. Right, Lumbini is in Nepal, and there's a brand new airport that's come up next to Lumbini. So I hope the air connectivities can be thickened, can be made more frequent and affordable for even average middle class Sri Lankans to be able to fly and visit Lumbini and pay respects to Lord Buddha, and while in Lumbini then also make Nepal a tourist destination. It's a beautiful country, the Himalayas, so from the Himalayas to the oceans, we can envision this people-to-people ties. On other fronts, on education, on health, on banking and finance, maybe there are areas of cooperation. I remember there's a Merchant Bank of Sri Lanka which had invested in Kathmandu a while ago. So these things can be forged, and it's easier because Sri Lanka going into India, this big country, can be overwhelming. Nepal and Sri Lanka are a similar sized, right? You are 22 million, we are 30 million. We're similar sized economies. In fact, the two countries that are almost identical are Nepal and Sri Lanka in terms of economic and your per capita income is higher, but population size is similar. So that's there. And on energy cooperation, well, I know you invested a lot on the solar, the renewables in the north of Sri Lanka, maybe with an eye for the Indian market, etc. But the hydro grid that we are building in the northeast part of South Asia, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and that has a tremendous potential, right? We have, in an era of climate change, India needs to displace its dirty sources of fuel, and as it becomes an economic powerhouse, increasingly it needs to transition to clean sources of fuel. So, and hydro, Nepal's hydro, the Himalayan rivers, I think will be very important. But once our energy, electrons start flowing in the Indian grid, it becomes fungible, you see. So what that means is then Sri Lanka also getting connected. So it becomes a sort of a regional grid electricity market where you can even trade instantly, right? Depending on prices and the flows, and that's the vision we have for the future. So physical connectivity through energy, digital, roads, rail, air, etc., and then the software connectivity that will then enable people-to-people interactions through businesses as well as for tourism and other purposes.
You met the president this time. Would you be looking forward to similar engagements or to return to Sri Lanka?
Oh, absolutely. As I mentioned, I love Sri Lanka, and any excuse that I can find to come back here, I'm on the next flight out.
Thank you very much, Dr. WAGLÉ, for your time. Busy schedule, I know, but thank you for sharing your expertise.
A pleasure, INDEEWARI. Thank you.
We had with us Dr. Swarnim WAGLÉ, Member of Parliament of Nepal and chairs the Institute of Integrated Development Studies, a South Asian policy think tank established in Kathmandu in 1979. And Dr. WAGLÉ is the former Chief Economic Advisor of the UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific in New York, covering 36 countries. Thank you. We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion at Hyde Park on Other Than a 24. Thank you for watching. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.